My name is Marisol Delgado. I am 34 years old, and I used to believe that working twice as hard as everyone else in the room would eventually make my father see me clearly. I was wrong. That belief held me together for the better part of a decade. It got me up at 5 in the morning when I was 22 and made me stay until the building went dark. It kept me quiet at family dinners when my brother Marco got the credit for numbers I had pulled, projections I had built, accounts I had personally salvaged from the edge of collapse. It made me swallow things that should not have been swallowed. And it was still with me, that belief, that stubborn, threadbare faith, the morning I sat across from my father in his office and told him I had found something worth buying. A piece of property that nobody wanted, in a corridor of highway that everyone had written off. A gas station that had sat dark and bolted since the winter of 1992. The county auction listing noted a padlocked storage room at the rear of the property, contents unknown, included in the sale. He looked at me the way he always looked at me when I brought him an idea. Not with interest. Not even with the mild attention you would give a stranger on the street. He looked at me like I had just tracked something in on the bottom of my shoe. That was March. By the following Tuesday, I had signed the purchase contract on my own. I want to explain how we got there. If you have ever worked inside a family business where the rules of the room were written before you arrived, you already know what I mean. The work was never the problem. I was good at the work. The problem was that being good at the work did not change what I was in that room, which was the younger daughter, the one without the title, the one who sat at the table but did not have a seat. And I want you to understand that before I tell you the rest of it. My father's name is Ernesto Delgado. He built Delgado family properties from a single duplex in the San Joaquin Valley into a mid-sized real estate holding company with commercial and residential assets spread across Central California. He is the kind of man who commands a room without raising his voice and who has never once, in my memory, admitted he was wrong about anything. Not a market read. Not a personnel decision. Not a daughter. I joined the company at 23, straight out of a finance degree I had paid for myself through a combination of scholarships, work-study shifts, and a part-time bookkeeping job I held all 4 years. My mother, Rosario, managed the company's administrative accounts. My brother Marco, 3 years older and the firstborn son, handled client relations and was being groomed, openly and without apology, to take over the business when my father stepped back. There was never any pretense about the order of things in our family. Marco was the heir. I was useful. I spent my first 2 years at Delgado Family Properties rebuilding their accounting infrastructure. The books were a mess, not fraudulently, just organically, the way things get messy when a small operation scales faster than its systems. I built them a proper chart of accounts, migrated everything to a platform that could actually support the volume they were doing, and put in place a monthly reconciliation process that my father had resisted for years because he preferred to trust his instincts over spreadsheets. Within 18 months, we had recovered nearly $60,000 in billing errors and late fee oversights that had simply been falling through the cracks. My father acknowledged this once, briefly, at a Monday staff meeting. He said the books were looking cleaner. Then he moved on. The gas station was called Ramos Highway Service, and it sat at the intersection of State Route 33 and a county road called Merced Flat Lane, about 11 miles outside of a small town in the Central Valley. The building was a 2-bay service station with a detached convenience store structure behind it, connected by a covered walkway that had partially collapsed on the east side. The canopy over the pump islands was still standing, which surprised me. The underground storage tanks had been decommissioned and sealed by the county in 1994, which was a problem but not an insurmountable one. The property was just over an acre. I had found it through a county surplus auction listing that I stumbled on while I was helping a colleague research adjacent parcels for a client. It had been sitting in county receivership for almost 9 years after the previous owner, a man named Hector Ramos, died without a clear succession plan and with enough back taxes owed that his estate could not carry the property. The auction reserve was $48,000. Nobody had bid on it in 2 previous cycles. I spent 3 weeks doing my own due diligence before I said a word to anyone. I pulled the parcel history, the environmental assessment filings, the decommissioning records on the tanks, the county's infrastructure improvement plans for Route 33, which included a planned widening project that had been in the pipeline for years and was now, finally, funded. I drove out there on a Saturday morning in February, walked the property alone, measured the footprint of the convenience store structure with a tape measure I brought in my bag, and stood at the edge of the pump island for a long time looking at the road. The traffic count on that stretch of highway was low. That was the surface red, the reason nobody wanted the parcel. But I had learned, through a decade of reading property cash flows and watching my father's instincts miss what the numbers were actually saying, that the surface red was only the beginning of an analysis, not the end. I drove the interchange 2 miles south and sat in the parking lot of a feed supply store for 20 minutes watching how traffic moved. I drove it again on a Sunday. The widening project was going to change the on-ramp geometry at the Route 33 interchange, and when that happened, the natural travel corridor was going to shift in a way that would funnel significantly more through traffic directly past this intersection. I had modeled it out 3 different ways. Every model said the same thing. I brought the file to my father on a Thursday afternoon. I had prepared a 1-page summary, a 4-page supporting analysis, and a projected 5-year revenue model for a reactivated fuel and convenience operation on the site. I set it on his desk. He picked up the 1-page summary, read perhaps the first third of it, and set it back down. "This is a derelict gas station, Marisol," he said. I told him the county infrastructure project changed the calculus on the location. He folded his hands on the desk. "I've been reading this valley for 30 years. A closed gas station on a back road doesn't become a commercial asset because of a county road project that may or may not be completed on schedule." I said the funding had already been appropriated. I had the documentation. He looked at me for a moment. "How much is the reserve?" $48,000, I told him. He shook his head, not unkindly, which in some ways was worse than if he had been sharp about it. "That's not where we put our capital, Mija. Find me something with an existing cash flow." I squared the papers in front of me and said nothing. I went home that night and sat at my kitchen table for a long time with the file open in front of me. I had a personal savings account that I had been building since I was 23. 11 years of consistent deposits, of living in a 1-bedroom apartment in Fresno and driving a car I had bought used and maintained myself, of taking no vacations that I did not drive to. The balance was just under $91,000. The auction was in 6 days. I called my father the following Sunday family dinner at my parents' house, which was a weekly fixture, and told him I was going to bid on the property myself. The table went quiet. My mother looked at her plate. My brother Marco, who was sitting across from me with a glass of wine halfway to his mouth, lowered it slowly. My father looked at me for a long moment. "With what?" he said. "With my savings," I told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Marisol, that is everything you have." "I know," I said. He picked up his fork. "Then I hope you understand what you're doing, because that money isn't coming back from a property like that." And Marco laughed. It was a short sound, almost reflexive, like he could not help it. "A gas station," he said. "You're going to blow your whole savings on a broken-down gas station." He shook his head. "You're a hopeless failure, Marisol. I mean that genuinely. You just don't know when something is dead." I looked at him across the table. My throat tightened just once in the 3 seconds before I answered. "I guess we'll see," I said. That was the kinder version of what my family thought about my judgment. The fuller version came out over the days that followed, in increments, the way it always did in our family. Not in one direct confrontation, but in a series of small moments designed to make you feel the weight of everyone else's opinion settling around you like a second atmosphere. My mother called me on a Monday to ask, gently, whether I had really thought it through. She said she was just worried. She said, "Your father knows the valley better than anyone, Mija, and if he passed on it, there is a reason." She said it the way she always said hard things, quietly and with genuine feeling, which made it harder to carry than if she had been cold about it. My brother called me on a Wednesday. He did not ask about my reasoning. He asked whether I had a contingency plan for when it went sideways, and when I started to explain the infrastructure project, he talked over me with a story about a property he had considered and passed on in 2019 that turned out to be an environmental remediation nightmare, which had nothing to do with what I was describing but which took 11 minutes to tell. When he finished, he said, Just don't come to Dad asking for a bailout when this doesn't work." Then he said he had to go. My father said nothing more directly. He did not need to. He had a way of making his position felt without repeating it, and for the next week, whenever I was in the office, the air in his vicinity carried a particular quality. The quality of a man who had already moved on from a subject because the outcome was, in his view, settled. I want to be honest with you. If you are watching this and you have ever had a family that loved you in ways that still managed to make you feel very small, you know exactly the particular exhaustion I am describing. Not cruelty for cruelty's sake. Just the steady, quiet weight of being the one whose judgment the room had already decided not to trust. I bid on the Ramos Highway Service property on a Tuesday morning in March. I was the only bidder. The final purchase price, including county fees and transfer costs, came to $52,400. I wired the funds that afternoon from the savings account I had been building for 11 years. I owned a gas station. I need to go back before I go forward because the property was only part of what I bought that day, and you need to understand the rest of it to understand what happened next. Ernesto Delgado had started the business with a duplex and a belief that property was the one thing that held its value when everything else was uncertain. That was not nothing. That instinct had built something real, and I do not want to pretend otherwise. But over the years, as the company grew, a pattern had solidified around it. A pattern about who in the family got to be right. I had been doing the company's financial analysis in a meaningful capacity since I was 25. Not peripherally. Centrally. The cash flow modeling that my father used to evaluate acquisition targets, that was mine. I had built the template he still used, in the version I last updated in the fall of the previous year. The lease negotiation framework we used for our commercial tenants. I had drafted that too, after spending 2 weekends reading comparable market lease structures from public REIT filings and adapting them to our scale. The property management fee schedule that Marco presented to my father in a Monday meeting in 2019 as his own work I had built that in a single weekend at his request, after he told me he had a presentation in 4 days and asked if I could put something together. He presented it with my name nowhere on it. My father had nodded and told Marco it was solid thinking. I had negotiated the refinancing on 3 of the company's commercial properties between 2019 and 2022, each time working directly with the lenders while Marco handled the client-facing relationship. The rate we secured on the Clovis Strip Center refinancing in 2021 was 40 basis points below what the broker had told my father to expect. I had spent 3 evenings that week pulling comparable loan-to-value ratios from public filings and presenting them to the lender's underwriter directly. My father had been pleased with the outcome. He had not asked how it happened. In 2020, when one of our anchor tenants in a strip center we owned in Visalia went into default on their lease, I had spent 6 weeks managing the workout, speaking with their counsel, modeling the abatement scenarios, ultimately structuring a deferral arrangement that kept them in the space and kept our cash flow from collapsing during a period when we could not have easily replaced them. My father had acknowledged the outcome. He had not asked how it was achieved. In 2021, I found a discrepancy in the trust accounts that my mother managed. Not fraud, genuinely not fraud, but a recurring misallocation that had been building for 3 years because of how a particular transaction type was being coded. Left alone, it would have caused a significant problem at the next audit. I corrected it quietly, without making it an incident, because making it an incident would have embarrassed my mother and destabilized the office. I told my father privately that I had found and corrected an accounting issue in the trust accounts. He thanked me and moved on. The year before I found the gas station, I had also been the one to catch a title defect on a residential fourplex my father had been close to purchasing in Tulare County. The seller's agent had missed it. The title company had missed it. I had found it on a Saturday afternoon while reviewing the preliminary title report, a junior lien that had not been properly discharged 15 years earlier and that would have become my father's liability the moment he took title. He had saved roughly $40,000 in future remediation costs because I had been careful on a weekend when nobody had asked me to be. He had not mentioned it after the deal was unwound. I had been the person who kept things from falling apart, quietly, for years, and I had accepted that role because I believed, for longer than I should have, that the work would eventually speak in a language my father could hear. It had not. What it had done, without my fully realizing it, was teach me exactly how to read a set of books at a deeper level than almost anyone I had ever worked with. It had taught me what healthy financials looked like and what compromised ones looked like and all the gradations in between. It had taught me what people thought they were hiding and where they actually put it. That education was about to matter more than I knew. I took possession of the Ramos Highway Service property on a Friday in late March. The county had given me a key, a single heavy old-fashioned key on a wire ring at the closing. There was a second key on the same ring, smaller, with a red plastic tag, labeled in handwriting so faded I had to hold it to the light to read it. It said back store. I drove out alone on a Saturday morning early before the day had fully warmed. The building smelled like dust and motor oil and something older underneath both of those things. The convenience store structure in the back had a padlock on its interior door that required the second key, which I had not yet used. I did the service bay first. The hydraulic lifts were long dead and would need to be replaced or removed. The floor drains were intact. The wiring was a concern. I had already gotten a preliminary assessment from an electrician I trusted, and the panel needed to be fully replaced, which was going to cost more than I wanted to spend before I understood the full scope of what I was dealing with. I walked the space methodically, photographing everything, making notes in the legal pad I had brought. The convenience store was next. I used the red-tagged key, turned the padlock, and pushed the door open. The interior was dim. A row of empty shelving units ran along the back wall. The counter was intact, the register long since gone. There was a display case on the right side that had held refrigerated items at some point. The compressor was still there, dead and rusted. There were cardboard boxes stacked along the left wall, which I had assumed were abandoned stock or equipment manuals, the kind of debris a closed business accumulates. I walked to the back of the store. There was a second door I had not noticed from the entry. A narrow door, set into the back wall, partially blocked by one of the shelving units that had been pushed diagonally across it. It was not padlocked. It opened with a push. Behind it was a storage room, maybe 10 feet by 12, with a bare concrete floor and a single ventilation window near the ceiling that let in a narrow column of gray morning light. Along the back wall, from floor to ceiling, were metal filing shelves. And on those shelves, arranged in neat labeled rows, were cardboard document boxes. I counted them from the doorway. 41 boxes. I stood there in the gray light of that storage room for a long moment, the legal pad still in my hand. I reached for the nearest box and looked at the label. My pulse caught. I pulled the box from the shelf, carried it to the counter in the convenience store, and opened it. I did not open all 41 boxes that first morning. I opened 8. That was enough. Hector Ramos had been a meticulous man. Every box was labeled by year and account type, and inside each one the documents were arranged in labeled manila folders. Monthly ledgers, supplier invoices, fuel delivery receipts, cash register tapes, handwritten inventory counts. The man had kept records the way some people keep gardens, with consistent attention and a particular kind of pride. The files went back to 1978, the year he had opened the station, and continued through 1991, the last full year of operation before he closed. But it was not the operational records that stopped me. It was the folder in the third box I opened, labeled in Hector Ramos's careful block printing. Inside it were 37 pages. Letters, meeting minutes, a hand-drawn map with annotations in blue ink, and a county assessor's valuation memo dated October 1989. The letters were between Hector Ramos and a county planning official whose name I did not recognize, and they concerned the same Route 33 widening project I had modeled in my own analysis, the one that was now, 30-some years later, finally funded and scheduled. He had known about it. He had been told about it, in writing, in 1989. The correspondence showed that the county had approached him informally about potential acquisition of a sliver of his frontage property for the eventual road expansion. The kind of quiet, early-stage outreach that happens years before a project moves to formal condemnation. Hector Ramos had declined to sell the frontage and had instead, based on the handwritten notes in the margins of one letter, tried to position his station to benefit from the eventual traffic increase. Then his health had declined. Then the project had stalled for decades. Then he had died. I sat at the counter of that dead convenience store for 2 hours, reading. When I finally stood up and stretched my back, I knew 3 things with complete certainty. First, my traffic impact model had been right. Second, the county's infrastructure timeline was further along than the public-facing documents suggested. There were internal correspondence references in these files that pointed to a much more aggressive completion schedule than what had been announced. And third, this property had not simply been overlooked by the market. It had been overlooked because nobody had known these files existed. I had bought them for $52,000. I spent the next 4 months working. I hired an environmental consultant to assess the tank remediation scope and found that the seal decommissioning had been done correctly and the liability was bounded and manageable. I hired a structural engineer to assess the canopy and the convenience store building. The canopy was sound, the east side walkway needed reinforcement, and the convenience store foundation was in better shape than the exterior suggested. I worked with the county planning office, using carefully the 1989 correspondence as a reference point to get informal confirmation of the project timeline. The planner I spoke with, a patient woman named Carol who had been with the department for 18 years, confirmed that the widening was tracking well ahead of the published schedule. She said it in the tone of someone stating an unremarkable fact. I wrote it down and drove home and sat with it for a long time. I brought in the electrician for the full panel assessment and got a number I could work with. I drafted a phased reopening plan with 2 scenarios, one that required outside capital and one that I could execute alone more slowly, using the remaining funds in my savings account and the income from my job. I told my family none of this. I kept going to Sunday dinners. I kept doing my work at Delgado Family Properties. I kept my father's books clean and my brother's analysis organized, and my mouth shut about what I was doing 11 miles outside of town on weekends and early mornings. In August, 6 months after I signed the purchase contract, a commercial real estate investor from Bakersfield contacted me through the county property records. He had seen the parcel transfer and wanted to know if I was interested in selling. He offered me $220,000. I thanked him and said I was not. He came back 3 weeks later at $280,000. I said I was still not selling, but I appreciated his interest. I did not mention either conversation to anyone. In October, the county formally announced the accelerated timeline for the Route 33 widening project. The press release was 2 paragraphs and ran in the local paper on a Thursday. By Monday morning, I had 3 calls from commercial brokers I had never spoken to, all asking about the Ramos Highway Service parcel. One of them was persistent enough to drive out and knock on the bay door while I was on site doing measurements. I thanked him and told him the property was not available. He left his card. I set it on the counter next to 8 others and kept working. That was the week my father called me into his office. He had the newspaper clipping on his desk. He had printed the county press release as well from the planning department's website. He had done his own research, which meant someone had told him something. I found out later it was a broker he knew, someone who had called looking to see if my father's company had any connection to the Route 33 corridor parcel and had mentioned my name in the process. My father looked older to me than he had in March. Or maybe I was just looking at him differently. "Tell me about the gas station," he said. I looked at him across the desk. "What would you like to know?" "The county project," he said. "You knew about it when you bought the property." "I modeled it, yes," I said. "I brought you the analysis in March." He was quiet for a moment. "The timeline. You knew it was accelerated." I told him I had found documentation in the property records at closing that suggested the internal timeline was ahead of what had been publicly announced. He looked at me with an expression I had not seen on him before, something careful and recalibrated. "What are you being offered?" he said. I folded the notepad I had brought and set it down on my knee. "I'm not selling. Marisol." "I'm not selling," I said again, evenly. "I'm reopening it." He sat back. "That requires capital you don't have." "I have a phased plan that doesn't require outside capital," I said. "And I have had 2 unsolicited acquisition offers that establish a market valuation baseline I can use to secure a commercial line of credit if I decide I want to move faster." He looked at me for a long moment. "How much?" "The second offer was $280,000, I said. "That was 6 weeks ago. The county announcement has moved the number." He was quiet. Then he said slowly, "I passed on this. You did, I said. I told you it was a mistake. You did, I said. He picked up the county press release and set it back down. I'd like to be involved in the next phase, he said. As a capital partner. Delgado Family Properties has the infrastructure for this kind of development. I looked at him steadily. I know, I said. I built that infrastructure. The room went quiet. I reached into the folder I had brought and placed 3 documents on his desk, one at a time. The first was a copy of the 1989, Route 33, correspondence I had found in the storage room. The second was my original acquisition analysis from March, the same one he had set down after reading 1/3 of it. The third was a current broker's opinion of value I had requested the previous week, which put the property at between $410,000 and $470,000, contingent on the widening project completion. I let him look at them. Dad, I said. You told me in March that you'd been reading this valley for 30 years and a closed gas station on a back road doesn't become a commercial asset because of a county road project that may or may not complete on schedule. I paused. I found the documentation that confirmed it would complete. You had already decided the property wasn't worth looking at, so you didn't look. He said nothing. You told me that wasn't where we put our capital, I said. What you meant was that it wasn't where you would put your capital. But it was mine to put where I decided. Marco called me a hopeless failure, I said. At Sunday dinner. In front of everyone. I kept my voice level. I've built your acquisition models since I was 25. I built the lease framework that Marco presented to you in 2019. He asked me to put it together in a weekend and I did, and I never said a word when he presented it without my name on it, because I thought eventually the work would speak for itself. I let that sit for a moment. The work I did for this family's company for 11 years is the exact work that told me this property was worth buying. Your judgment passed on it. My judgment bought it. He looked down at the broker's opinion. I don't need a capital partner, I said. I need you to understand what you've been looking at for 11 years. I picked up my folder, stood, and walked out of his office. I did not slam the door. My mother called that evening. She did not lead with an apology, but there was something different in her voice, a kind of careful quiet that I recognized as the sound of her recalibrating. She said my father had been in his office for 3 hours after I left. She said he had not come out for dinner. She said, after a pause, he showed me the papers, Marisol. And then she said nothing for a moment. And then she said, I didn't know you built the lease system. I told her there were a lot of things she didn't know. She was quiet for a moment. I know, she said. Marco did not call. He texted 3 days later a single line, heard about the gas station. Congrats. No punctuation after it. I read it once and set my phone down. I hired a project manager in November and broke ground on the first phase of the renovation, electrical, structural reinforcement of the convenience store, and permit filings for the fuel system reactivation, the following January. The county's widening project broke ground on Route 33 the same month, 8 weeks ahead of the revised public schedule. By the following spring, I had a letter of intent from a regional fuel distributor for a supply agreement, a conditional approval from the county for full commercial reactivation, and a standing acquisition offer of $540,000 that I continued to decline. My father drove out to the property on a Saturday in April, unannounced, and stood at the edge of the pump island for a long time without saying anything. I was there when he arrived. I did not tell him I had been expecting him. He looked at the canopy, the new electrical panel visible through the open bay door, the framing of the expanded convenience store footprint. He walked the perimeter slowly, the way he had always walked properties, hands in his coat pockets, head slightly down, absorbing the dimensions of a thing before he spoke about it. I had watched him do it 100 times at other people's properties. I had never watched him do it at mine. You did this without us, he said. Yes, I said. He nodded slowly and looked at the road. Traffic moved past steadily in both directions, the new lane geometry already in place from the first completed phase of the widening. You were right, he said. came out quietly, the way things come out when a person is not accustomed to saying them. I looked at him. I know, I said. I have thought many times about what it cost me to be right. Not the money. The money was the easy part, the part that had a number attached to it and could be tracked and modeled and confirmed. What it cost me was the decade before the money. 11 years of doing the work that built something and watching other people's names go on it, of believing that patience was a strategy when really it was just what I had decided to survive on. What I know now is that the work was never going to speak for itself inside a room where the room had already decided who the speakers were. The gas station did not make my father see me. The gas station gave me somewhere to stand that was entirely mine, and from there I could say what I had always known and have it land differently, because it was no longer a daughter asking to be heard inside her father's company. It was a business owner with documentation and a broker's opinion of value and 41 boxes of records she had bought for $52,000 and turned into something the market was offering $500,000 for. The lesson, if there is one, is not that you should go buy an abandoned gas station. It is that the moment you stop asking the room to validate what you already know and start building something outside the room, that is the moment the room starts listening. If any part of this story felt familiar to you, if you have ever watched someone else put their name on your work, or been told your judgment wasn't worth the table it was sitting at, share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Sometimes the right story finds the right person at exactly the right moment. This is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. Names, characters, businesses, events, and incidents are the products of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental.